If Prince Harry had nothing to hide, why did the palace wait this long? That's the question that keeps resurfacing. Quietly, persistently, not shouted by headlines or splashed across front pages, but hovering in the background like an unfinished sentence. Because what happened this week didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with timing. And timing, in royal life, is rarely accidental. Just hours after Prince Harry stepped back into a London courtroom, again, to continue his legal war against the British press, something else began circulating. Not a statement, not a denial, not even a briefing, but footage, chilling in its restraint, mundane in its framing, and devastating in what it implied. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Security video, not grainy paparazzi shots, not leaked mobile clips, but internal palace footage, the kind that doesn't emote, doesn't editorialize, doesn't accuse. It just records corridors, movement, access, time. And suddenly, the story everyone thought they were watching, a duke versus the tabloids, truth versus intrusion, privacy versus power, felt like it shifted sideways. Not forward, sideways, into something colder, something institutional. Because if this footage exists, and the palace chose now to let it be seen, then the question isn't simply what it shows. It's why it was never denied, and why it was never used before. For weeks, Prince Harry's return to the UK has been framed as defiant, principled, a man standing up to what he claims was years of illegal intrusion by the press. He has accused Associated Newspapers, publisher of the Daily Mail, of unlawfully gathering private information, phone hacking, surveillance, the familiar allegations, the same ones that have echoed through British courtrooms for more than a decade now. Associated Newspapers, for their part, have vigorously denied the claims. That much is on the record. But here's the thing that doesn't sit neatly. This week's tension wasn't created by testimony. It wasn't triggered by a dramatic cross-examination or a legal ambush. It came from outside the courtroom, from the very institution Prince Harry once insisted was as much a victim of press intrusion as he was. The palace, and at its center, King Charles III. A man whose silence has often been mistaken for weakness, and whose restraint has been misread, time and again, as indecision. That misreading may finally be catching up with people, because the footage didn't arrive loudly. There was no triumphant release, no palace aide briefing journalists with glee, no official comment attached to it at all. And that's what makes it unsettling. It wasn't framed as retaliation. It wasn't framed as evidence. It wasn't framed as anything. It was simply there. Which raises a difficult possibility, one that sits uncomfortably with the narrative many have accepted without question. What if the palace has always known more than it has ever said? And what if its silence wasn't about protection, but about patience? For years, Prince Harry has described his relationship with the royal institution as fractured by betrayal. He has spoken of feeling exposed, targeted, unfairly watched. In interviews, in documentaries, in court filings. Always the same emotional through line, intrusion, the sense that his private life was never truly his own. And yet, now we are confronted with a reversal that's hard to ignore. Because the footage that surfaced doesn't show him being watched by journalists. It suggests he was the one moving unseen. That's not an accusation. It's an implication. And implications are often more powerful than claims, because they force the audience to fill in the gaps themselves. Ask yourself this. And be honest. If this footage showed something benign, something easily explained, something consistent with public statements, wouldn't the palace have denied its significance immediately? Wouldn't a spokesperson have stepped forward to contextualize it, to clarify, to neutralize? Instead, there was nothing. No pushback, no reframing, just quiet confirmation that the footage was real. And silence. That silence landed differently because of when it arrived. Prince Harry wasn't just back in the UK. He was back under oath, back in a courtroom, back insisting that others had crossed lines into his private life. And then, almost cruelly in its precision, the palace allowed a glimpse into something he had not spoken about publicly at all. His own movements, his own access, his own presence inside the very institution he has repeatedly portrayed as distant, closed off, even hostile. This isn't about catching someone out in a lie. Not directly. It's about credibility, about narrative ownership, about who gets to define what intrusion actually looks like. Because there's a difference between being watched and being allowed in. And the palace knows that difference better than anyone. What's striking is how little effort has been made to sensationalize this moment. No dramatic music. No breathless commentary from official channels. The footage didn't need help. Its power came from its ordinariness. From how unremarkable it looked on the surface. Hallways don't dramatize themselves. Doors don't explain why they open. Access logs don't shout. But institutions understand something that individuals often forget. The quietest evidence is usually the hardest to argue with. This is where the story stops being about one lawsuit and starts becoming about leverage. Because the palace did not have to release this footage. It could have stayed buried in archives, accessed only by security teams and administrators. It could have remained irrelevant. And yet, here it is, emerging not during a family reconciliation, not during a memoir release, not during a public feud, but during a legal proceeding where truth, consistency, and credibility matter more than emotion. That timing isn't coincidence. It's communication. And it forces a new question into the open. Is Prince Harry fighting the press? Or fighting to control a story that the palace has quietly outgrown? There's another uncomfortable layer here, too. For years, critics have accused the royal family of being cold, calculating, even cruel in its handling of internal conflict, of prioritizing the institution over individuals, of choosing silence when explanation might have softened blows. But what if silence wasn't avoidance? What if it was containment? Consider this. The palace did not contradict Harry publicly when he spoke about being cut off. It did not challenge his emotional truth. It did not release counter-narratives when he accused unnamed insiders of leaking information. Again and again, it absorbed the damage, allowed its own reputation to be questioned, allowed public sympathy to shift. Until now. And even now, it hasn't spoken. It has simply allowed reality to intrude. That distinction matters, because speaking invites debate. Evidence invites reckoning. And the footage doesn't explain itself, which means it doesn't need to. It simply exists as a silent contradiction to a carefully curated image. This is where the audience has to pause. Not rush to judgment. Not pick sides. But sit with the discomfort. If Prince Harry's legal battle is built on the premise that his privacy was violated, repeatedly and unlawfully, then how does undisclosed palace access complicate that narrative? Does it undermine it? Or does it reveal a more complex truth, one where multiple systems of power were at play, not all of them adversarial? And more importantly, why didn't Harry address this himself? Because he could have, preemptively, voluntarily. He could have disclosed palace access, contextualized it, explained it away. Instead, the story surfaced without his framing attached to it at all. That absence speaks, not loudly, but clearly. This introduction isn't about declaring guilt or innocence. It's about acknowledging that the ground has shifted, that the story everyone thought they were watching has quietly become something else. A family dispute disguised as a legal crusade. A battle over surveillance reframed as a question of access. And a monarchy that has said less than anyone, but revealed more than it ever intended to. We're only at the beginning of this unraveling. Because the footage raises questions it doesn't answer. Who authorized its release? Who decided the timing? And what else exists that has never been shown? Because if this was the first move, quiet, restrained, almost reluctant, then it wasn't meant to end the conversation. It was meant to change it. And what comes next won't be about the press at all. It will be about the palace, and how much longer it's willing to stay silent. The courtroom wasn't supposed to feel like a stage. That's the thing people forget. Trials, especially civil ones, are meant to be procedural. Dry, boring even. Lawyers speak. Judges listen. Paperwork accumulates. Nothing cinematic. Nothing dramatic. And yet, the moment Prince Harry walked back into the UK's legal system this time, it was clear something had shifted. Not in the law itself. In the atmosphere around it. Because this trial was never just about what happened to Harry years ago. It was about what he was saying now. And more importantly, what he was asking the court and the public to believe. At face value, the case is straightforward. Harry alleges that Associated Newspapers, publisher of the Daily Mail, engaged in illegal methods to obtain private information about him. Phone hacking, surveillance, unlawful intrusion. The familiar architecture of a media accountability case. Associated Newspapers denies the allegations. Vigorously. Again, that part is clean. But what's been quietly unsettling observers inside the courtroom isn't the legal argument itself. It's the emotional framing Harry brings with him. The way his story has evolved. The way certain details are emphasized and others are conspicuously absent. Because when you strip away the legal language, Harry's testimony isn't just saying, "The press wronged me." It's saying, "I was hunted." That distinction matters. Being wronged implies wrongdoing. Being hunted implies intent, persistence, and a lack of refuge. It suggests there was nowhere safe. No institution capable of protecting him. No walls thick enough to keep intrusion out. And yet, that's precisely where the contradiction begins to take shape. Because the trial isn't unfolding in a vacuum. It's unfolding alongside a growing awareness that Harry's relationship with the palace, the same institution he's often framed as either complicit or powerless, was far more complex than his public narrative has allowed. Let's slow this down. In court, Harry speaks as someone who felt exposed at every turn, watched, targeted, betrayed by systems that were supposed to shield him. He positions himself as an individual against a machine, one man versus a media apparatus. It's compelling. It's emotionally coherent. And for many watching, it feels familiar. But trials aren't won on emotional coherence. They're won on consistency. And consistency is where this case begins to strain. Because even as Harry argues that his private life was relentlessly intruded upon, the palace footage that surfaced suggests something else entirely. That he retained access to one of the most controlled, surveilled, and restricted environments in the country long after he publicly described his separation from it. Now, to be clear, access does not equal immunity. Being inside the palace doesn't mean one's privacy can't be violated. That's not the argument. The issue is narrative framing. If Harry was truly cut off, truly excluded, truly operating without institutional shelter, then undisclosed palace access complicates that picture in ways that are hard to ignore. Why? Because it suggests layers. Layers of protection, layers of permission, layers of quiet coordination that were never acknowledged publicly. And courts care about layers. This is where the lawsuit stops being a simple media case and starts brushing up against something more delicate: credibility. Judges don't need a perfect witness, but they do need a consistent one. And the problem for Harry isn't that the footage exists. It's that he never addressed it. Not in interviews. Not in documentaries. Not in prior statements. Not now. That omission creates space. And space invites scrutiny. Inside the courtroom, observers have noted moments where Harry appears deeply confident, even indignant, as he recounts perceived injustices. But there are also moments where his testimony seems carefully narrow, focused on specific instances, specific publications, specific timeframes. Again, that's not unusual. Lawyers often advise witnesses to stay within scope. But when a witness's broader public narrative extends far beyond that scope, and the institution at the center of it releases contradictory evidence, the court is left with a quiet tension it cannot ignore. Because this trial isn't just adjudicating past press behavior. It's assessing present-day reliability. And that's where the palace's timing becomes so consequential. The footage didn't interrupt testimony. It didn't derail proceedings. It didn't force a recess. It simply arrived alongside them, creating a parallel line of interpretation. Almost as if to say, while you're listening to one story, remember, there's another. That's not a legal tactic. It's an institutional one. Think about it. If the palace wanted to undermine Harry outright, it could have done so years ago. It could have corrected public statements, leaked counter-narratives, briefed friendly outlets. Instead, it absorbed criticism, allowed its silence to be interpreted as guilt, indifference, or incompetence, until the legal stakes shifted, until Harry's claims moved from interviews into affidavits, from documentaries into sworn testimony. That's when narrative becomes evidence, and evidence invites response. This is the part many casual observers miss. Institutions don't respond emotionally. They respond when consequences attach. A lawsuit alleging illegal intrusion doesn't just challenge a media company. It reopens old questions about how information flowed around royal households. Who knew what? Who protected whom? Who failed? And if Harry's claims imply systemic failure, or worse, complicity, then the palace has a vested interest in clarifying the record without saying a word. Enter the footage. not accompanied by commentary, not framed as rebuttal, simply released into the public consciousness like a quiet counterweight. It doesn't say Harry is lying. It says the story is incomplete. That difference is everything. Because incompleteness doesn't provoke outrage. It provokes doubt. And doubt is far more corrosive. Ask yourself this, and don't rush the answer. If Harry's legal case is as airtight as it's presented, why does this footage feel destabilizing? Why does it linger? Why does it matter at all? The answer isn't legal. It's psychological. Because the case has been built not just on facts, but on moral clarity. On a clean division between watcher and watched, victim and aggressor. The footage muddies that division. It introduces ambiguity where certainty was being asked for. And courts are deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity when credibility is on the line. This is where the high court setting becomes symbolic, not just procedural. Inside the walls of the High Court of Justice, narratives are weighed not by volume, but by coherence, by whether claims align across time, context, and disclosure. Harry's story, taken alone, is coherent. Harry's story, placed alongside the palace's quiet revelations, becomes fractured, not broken, fractured. And fractures don't collapse structures immediately. They spread, slowly, invisibly, until pressure is applied. That pressure is coming. Because this trial isn't happening in isolation. It's happening in a media environment already primed to question Harry's version of events. Fatigued, in some cases, by repeated claims of betrayal. Conflicted by the oscillation between seeking privacy and embracing exposure. The palace footage taps directly into that fatigue. Not by accusing, by reminding. Reminding the public that there are records, logs, systems. That memory isn't held only by those who speak the loudest. And that silence doesn't mean absence. It means waiting. This is why Chapter 1 matters. Not because it proves anything, it doesn't. Not because it resolves contradictions, it won't. But because it reframes the trial itself. What if this lawsuit isn't just Harry versus the press? What if it's Harry versus a version of events that can no longer be contained? Because once institutional memory enters the room, even silently, the dynamics change, and the courtroom becomes less about what the press did, and more about who gets to define reality now. The footage didn't interrupt the trial. It reframed it. And in doing so, it set the stage for something far more uncomfortable. The realization that this legal battle may not end with a verdict at all. It may end with a reckoning. And that reckoning, as we're about to see, was never meant to begin in court. It's tempting to imagine that the most dangerous evidence always looks dramatic. A flash drive slid across a table. A grainy clip leaked at midnight. A whistleblower stepping forward, trembling. But the footage at the center of this story does none of that. It doesn't shout. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't even explain itself. And that's precisely why it matters. Because what emerged wasn't designed to convince anyone. It was designed to exist. Security footage has a peculiar authority. Not because it's infallible, it isn't, but because it doesn't ask for belief. It simply presents movement in space and time. No adjectives, no emotion, no motive, just sequence. And when that kind of footage comes from inside a royal palace, the implications ripple far beyond whatever is visible on screen. This is where we need to slow down again. Because the question is not what the video shows. The question is why it was never supposed to be seen. Royal palaces are not casual environments. Every corridor, every entrance, every restricted area is governed by layers of protocol developed over centuries and refined relentlessly in the modern era. Access isn't informal. It's logged, scheduled, approved, reviewed. Nothing inside those walls happens by accident. So when footage surfaces that appears to show Prince Harry moving through palace space without public acknowledgement, the issue isn't whether he had a reason to be there. Of course he could have. The issue is disclosure. Because this wasn't a family photo. It wasn't a ceremonial appearance. It wasn't a documented engagement. It was movement, quiet, unremarked, uncontextualized, and silence, in this case, is louder than any explanation. Let's be precise. The footage does not portray wrongdoing. It does not depict confrontation. It does not reveal secrets in the cinematic sense. What it reveals is access. And access is the most tightly controlled currency in royal life. For years, Prince Harry's public narrative has emphasized separation, distance, estrangement. The idea that once he stepped back from royal duties, the doors closed behind him, emotionally and institutionally. That framing has been central to how audiences understand his legal claims. If he was cut off, unsupported, left exposed, then the press becomes the primary antagonist. But the footage introduces a complication that cannot be ignored. Because it suggests that even amid public estrangement, certain doors remained open. And that raises questions no interview ever addressed. Who authorized that access? Who knew? And perhaps most importantly, who decided not to tell the public? This is where the footage becomes unsettling. Not because of what it proves nothing on its own, but because of what it contradicts. In previous public statements, Harry has described a palace environment that felt hostile, unwelcoming, even unsafe. He has spoken of being trapped, surveilled, manipulated, of wanting out, of needing distance. And yet here is evidence, understated, unembellished, that suggests continued institutional proximity. Those two realities don't cancel each other out, but they don't align either. And misalignment is where credibility starts to erode. The palace understands this intimately. That's why the release was handled the way it was. No commentary, no briefing war, no official framing, just confirmation that the footage was real. And then nothing. Because once something like this exists in the public sphere, it no longer belongs to the institution. It belongs to interpretation, to inference, to the slow accumulation of doubt. Think about the restraint involved here. The palace could have contextualized the footage. It could have explained it away. It could have issued a statement emphasizing routine security procedures or family logistics. Instead, it did the opposite. It allowed ambiguity to do the work. And ambiguity is a far sharper instrument than accusation. This brings us to the most overlooked element of this entire episode: archiving. Security footage inside royal residences is not kept casually. Storage is deliberate. Retention periods are defined. Access permissions are narrow. Footage is reviewed, cataloged, and, when necessary, preserved. So the fact that this footage existed long enough to be released now tells us something critical. Someone, at some point, decided it mattered. Not in the moment, not urgently, but enough to ensure it wasn't erased. That decision may have been administrative, procedural, boring even, but boring decisions are often the most consequential, because they reflect institutional foresight, not emotional reaction, which leads to a quietly disturbing possibility. What if the palace didn't preserve this footage because it anticipated conflict, but because it anticipated revision? Revision of narrative. Revision of memory. Revision of public understanding. Institutions that last centuries learn one thing early. People reinterpret the past constantly. Documents, logs, and footage exist not to punish, but to anchor reality when stories drift too far. And in this case, the story may have drifted. Let's ask a question most commentators have avoided. If Prince Harry's access to palace spaces continued beyond what the public believed, why didn't he disclose it himself? There are benign answers to that. Private family arrangements, security considerations, emotional complexity. But none of those answers change the central issue. Once you frame yourself publicly as cut off, any undisclosed access becomes a liability, not legally, but narratively. And narratives are what this lawsuit depends on. Because the case against Associated Newspapers is not being judged by the public on technicalities alone. It's being judged on moral clarity, on whether Harry's depiction of his circumstances feels honest, complete, and proportionate. The footage doesn't negate his claims, but it does complicate them. And complication is dangerous in a story that relies on clean lines. Here's another detail worth lingering on. The footage was not leaked by journalists. It did not emerge from a tabloid source. It did not arrive via anonymous tipsters or disgruntled staff. It came from the palace. That distinction matters enormously, because it undercuts one of the lawsuit's emotional foundations, that Harry's private movements were exposed only through unlawful press behavior. This exposure came from inside the institution, deliberately, quietly, lawfully, which forces a reevaluation. If the palace was willing to let this be seen, what does that suggest about its assessment of risk? Because institutions do not release material that weakens their own position unless the alternative is worse. And what could be worse than silence? Only distortion. For years, silence allowed the public to fill in gaps with assumption. sympathy, speculation. But silence also allows stories to harden. And once hardened, they can begin to damage the institution itself, especially when those stories are carried into courtrooms and formalized under oath. At that point, silence becomes complicity. The footage, then, can be read as a course correction. Not aggressive, not vindictive, corrective. A way of saying, this is part of the picture that has been missing. Nothing more, nothing less. And yet, its impact is disproportionate. Because it introduces the idea that Prince Harry's experience of being watched may not have been as one-sided as he's described. Not watched by the press, but watched by the institution, which raises an uncomfortable symmetry. Harry claims intrusion. The palace responds with evidence of oversight. Both can be true, but only one has chosen to speak about it publicly, until now. There's a psychological element here that's easy to miss. When people believe they are victims of surveillance, they often underestimate how much they are also being protected, monitored, documented, contained. Royal life is built on that paradox. Privacy is guarded through control, not absence. And control leaves traces. Those traces don't accuse. They wait. This is why the footage feels chilling. Not because it exposes wrongdoing, but because it exposes memory. And memory is dangerous when narratives depend on forgetting. As this chapter closes, the most pressing question isn't about legality or protocol. It's about awareness. Did Prince Harry know this footage existed? Did he assume it would never surface? Or did he believe, genuinely, that his version of events had become the only one that mattered? Because if he misjudged that, then the next phase of this story will not be about the press at all. It will be about what happens when personal truth collides with institutional record. And institutions, unlike individuals, do not forget. They archive. And once an archive begins to speak, even quietly, it rarely stops at one revelation. Waiting is often mistaken for weakness. In modern life, hesitation is framed as failure. If you don't respond immediately, you're losing. If you don't clarify instantly, you're hiding something. If you don't deny fast enough, the story hardens without you. But that logic doesn't apply to institutions that think in decades. And it certainly doesn't apply to the monarchy. Because what's becoming clearer now, uncomfortably clear, is that King Charles III did not react to Prince Harry's accusations. He absorbed them. For years. That distinction matters more than people realize. King Charles inherited a crown shaped by silence long before he inherited it formally. A system trained not to argue in public, not to chase narratives, not to correct every misinterpretation. The monarchy survives not by winning daily news cycles, but by outlasting them. And that instinct, endure, don't engage, has defined Charles's reign far more than his critics expected, which is why this moment feels so jarring. Because when the palace finally allowed that footage to surface, it wasn't reactive. It was surgical. Let's rewind slightly, not to rehash history, but to understand temperament. Charles has always been portrayed as emotional, sensitive, occasionally indecisive, a man overshadowed by stronger personalities. That image stuck for decades, reinforced by moments of visible frustration and a reputation for internalizing criticism. But behind that image has always been something else. Institutional fluency. Charles understands one thing instinctively. When you speak too early, you surrender control. When you speak too often, you dilute authority. And when you respond emotionally, you lose leverage. So he didn't. When Prince Harry spoke publicly about betrayal, Charles didn't counter. When Harry suggested the palace failed to protect him, Charles didn't clarify. When documentaries painted a picture of isolation and abandonment, Charles stayed quiet. Not because he had nothing to say, because saying it would have ended his ability to choose when it mattered. Silence, in this context, wasn't passive. It was preservative. And that preservation has paid off in a way that's only now becoming visible. The release of the footage did not feel like a father lashing out. It didn't carry the emotional tone of resentment or humiliation. There was no sense of how dare you. If anything, it felt colder than that. More institutional. More final. Which raises an uncomfortable realization. This wasn't a personal decision. It was a crown decision. That's a line many observers struggle to accept. The idea that family dynamics inside the monarchy eventually stop being personal at all. That there's a moment, quiet, often invisible, when the individual becomes subordinate to the role. And for Charles, That moment likely arrived not when Harry left, but when Harry returned to court. Because court changes everything. When grievances become sworn testimony, they stop being private pain. They become historical record. They shape precedent. They implicate systems. And systems respond. Not emotionally, structurally. This is the lens through which the footage must be viewed. Not as punishment, as boundary setting. The palace did not say Harry was wrong. It said, here is something that exists alongside your story. That's it. No interpretation attached. Which is exactly how institutions correct narratives without appearing defensive. They introduce facts, not feelings. And facts don't argue. They wait to be weighed. There's a subtle irony here that's hard to ignore. Prince Harry has often accused the palace of being obsessed with image, of prioritizing optics over people, of hiding behind protocol to avoid accountability. And yet, in this moment, the palace did the opposite of what an image-obsessed institution would do. It released something visually unflattering, emotionally ambiguous, and narratively destabilizing, with no attempt to control how it would be received. That's not spin. That's confidence. Confidence that the truth, even partial, will do its work without embellishment. Confidence that the institution can withstand whatever conclusions the public draws. Confidence that silence, paired with documentation, is stronger than rebuttal. This is where Charles's long game becomes apparent. He didn't correct Harry when Harry spoke emotionally. He waited until Harry spoke formally, until claims hardened into legal assertions, until the story crossed a threshold where it could no longer be dismissed as personal catharsis. At that point, the palace had a responsibility, not to the family, but to the institution. And institutions do not allow themselves to be redefined unilaterally. This isn't about revenge. That framing is too simplistic. Revenge seeks satisfaction. This seeks stabilization. Because Harry's lawsuit doesn't exist in isolation. It sits within a broader legal and cultural reckoning over media ethics, privacy, and power. And the monarchy, like it or not, is a recurring character in that reckoning. If Harry's narrative had gone unchallenged, it would eventually become precedent. Not legally, but culturally. It would shape how future disputes are interpreted, how responsibility is assigned, how blame is distributed. Charles understands that. And so the palace intervened, not loudly, not fully, but just enough. Enough to say, the record is more complex than it appears. There's another layer here that deserves attention. The footage was not framed as a counterargument to Harry's claims. It was framed as reality, which means the palace did not feel the need to persuade. Persuasion implies doubt. This was about context. And context is what courts, historians, and institutions care about long after public outrage fades. Ask yourself this. If Charles wanted to damage Harry personally, wouldn't he have done it differently? Wouldn't there have been leaks? Briefings? Anonymous quotes painting Harry as reckless or dishonest. Instead, there was restraint bordering on indifference. That's not the behavior of someone seeking to win a family feud. That's the behavior of someone drawing a line between personal narrative and institutional memory, between grievance and record, between emotion and archive. And that line is not easily crossed back. Because once the palace signals that it is willing to let documentation speak, it changes the dynamic permanently. It says, this is no longer a conversation. It's a ledger. And ledgers don't care how passionately you argue. They care what was logged. This is why the footage feels like a warning without being one. It doesn't threaten future releases. It doesn't hint at escalation. But it implies capacity. And capacity is often more intimidating than action. The palace is effectively saying, we have a memory. And we are prepared to let parts of it surface if necessary. That's not aggression. That's deterrence. And it reframes every future move Harry might make. Because from this point on, every claim will be weighed against the possibility of unseen context. Every assertion will invite the silent question. Is there something else we don't know? That question alone is enough to shift power. Which brings us back to Charles. For decades, he was portrayed as reactive, oversensitive, too eager to be understood. But this moment reveals something else. A man who waited until the stakes were no longer emotional, but existential. Until the issue was no longer about hurt feelings, but institutional integrity. And then, quietly, he acted. Not as a father, as a monarch. That distinction is brutal, but it's real. And it may explain why this feels so irreversible. Because once a monarch chooses the crown over the family, publicly, however subtly, the relationship doesn't return to where it was. It can coexist. It can soften. But it can't unsee what's been seen. And neither can the public. This chapter doesn't end with confrontation. It ends with a recalibration, a sense that the rules have changed, that silence is no longer guaranteed, and that if Prince Harry continues down this path, legal, public, absolute, he may discover that the palace's patience was never infinite, only strategic, because what comes next won't be driven by emotion at all. It will be driven by record, and records, once they begin to surface, tend to bring more with them. There's a moment that doesn't show up on camera. It never makes the official transcripts. It doesn't appear in press summaries or legal filings. But people in the room notice it immediately. It's the moment when confidence falters, just slightly. Not collapse, not panic, just a flicker. And according to multiple observers inside and around the proceedings, that moment came not during cross-examination, not when lawyers pressed on details, but after the footage became impossible to ignore. Because the release of that video didn't confront Prince Harry directly. It didn't need to. It sat there, quiet, unanswered, and that's when the tone shifted. This is important to understand. Harry did not respond publicly to the footage. No statement, no clarification, no contextual interview, no legal counter, nothing. For someone who has been willing, even eager, to explain his perspective in the past, that absence was conspicuous. An absence, in moments like this, becomes its own form of communication. Inside the courtroom, Harry's demeanor had already been under scrutiny. He entered with a composure that suggested certainty. Shoulders set, expression controlled, the posture of someone who believes he's on solid ground. But after the footage began circulating, something subtle changed. Not theatrics, no outbursts, just restraint in places where openness had previously been his strength. Observers noted longer pauses before answering, slightly more guarded phrasing, a noticeable effort to stay within narrowly defined boundaries. That's not an admission of anything, but it is a recalibration. And recalibration usually happens when someone realizes the terrain is no longer predictable. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Harry's public power has always come from emotional transparency, from speaking openly about pain, anger, betrayal, from telling his story in a way that felt raw and unfiltered. That transparency built trust, but it also created an expectation that when questions arose, he would answer them. This time he didn't, and that silence was jarring because it broke pattern. Ask yourself this. If the footage were easily explained, routine, benign, consistent with his public narrative, why not explain it? Why allow speculation to spiral? Why let ambiguity fester? The obvious answers. Legal advice, strategic restraint, ongoing proceedings, all make sense. But they don't erase the perception problem. Because perception isn't built on what's legally prudent. It's built on what feels coherent. And coherence is where the reaction began to unravel. The phrase that kept resurfacing among observers wasn't anger. It was contained fury. Not explosive, not uncontrolled, but tightly held. The kind that shows itself in jaw tension, in clipped responses, in the deliberate avoidance of certain topics. There's a reason this matters. In high-stakes legal battles, emotional control is expected, but emotional shifts are noticed. They're read as signals, not of guilt, but of pressure. And pressure changes behavior. What the footage did, and this is crucial, was not to disprove Harry's claims. It did something more destabilizing. It introduced doubt about completeness, not dishonesty. Incompleteness. That's a far more difficult accusation to counter, because it doesn't accuse someone of lying. It suggests they've been selective. And selection implies intention. For years, Harry has framed himself as someone forced into exposure. Someone whose private life was dragged into public view against his will. Now, suddenly, there was evidence of private movement that he himself had never disclosed. The symmetry is uncomfortable. And it raises a question that many have been reluctant to voice out loud. Is it possible that Harry has been both watched and protected? Both exposed and shielded? Both victim and participant? Those aren't mutually exclusive roles, but they complicate the moral clarity his case depends on. This is where the emotional reaction becomes telling. Because when people feel morally secure, they explain. When they feel misunderstood, they clarify. When they feel misrepresented, they correct. Silence tends to emerge when explanation risks unraveling something else. And that's what seems to have happened here. There were no visible attempts to control the narrative after the footage surfaced. No effort to reframe it as routine family access. No suggestion that it contradicted nothing. Just quiet. That quiet landed heavily because it contrasted so sharply with past behavior. Prince Harry has never been afraid of conversation, which means this wasn't fear. It was calculation. Calculation born of the realization that any explanation might open doors he couldn't close again. Because once you begin explaining access, you must explain permission. Once you explain permission, you must explain relationship. And once you explain relationship, you begin dismantling the image of total estrangement. That image is emotionally powerful, but it's also fragile. The footage cracked it, not with force, but with presence. Inside the courtroom, that crack didn't explode. It spread. Slowly, through whispered conversations, through raised eyebrows, through the careful wording of questions that suddenly carried more weight. Lawyers didn't need to reference the footage directly. They didn't need to. Its existence changed the room. Because credibility in court isn't just about what you say. It's about what you don't. And now there was something Harry hadn't said. Something he hadn't volunteered. Something the palace had let speak instead. The emotional toll of that realization is not trivial. Harry has spent years insisting that his truth was ignored, minimized, dismissed. That no one listened until he spoke loudly enough. Now, for the first time, he was confronted with a truth he didn't control. And control has always been central to his sense of agency. That loss of narrative control doesn't look like panic. It looks like anger turned inward, contained, measured, watchful. Observers described a visible effort to remain composed, to avoid giving anything away. That effort itself became noticeable. When someone is relaxed, composure is effortless. When someone is under strain, composure becomes a performance. And performances, no matter how polished, reveal effort. This is where the phrase, blushed with anger, began circulating, not as a literal description, but as an emotional shorthand. Not rage. Frustration. The frustration of realizing that a story you believed you owned has grown larger than you. The frustration of understanding that silence, once your ally, has become someone else's weapon. Because the palace didn't accuse Harry of sneaking. It didn't label his actions. It didn't even contextualize them. It simply allowed others to notice that he had been there, and that noticing did the rest. Which leads to the most revealing part of Harry's reaction. He didn't escalate. He didn't counterattack. He didn't challenge the palace. That restraint suggests something important. He knows where this could go, and he knows he doesn't want it to, because escalation would invite response. And response, from an institution that has already demonstrated its willingness to release documentation, is unpredictable. This is the paradox Harry now faces. For years, he has accused the palace of using silence to protect itself. Now, silence is protecting him. As long as he doesn't push further. As long as he doesn't demand explanations. As long as he doesn't challenge the implication. Because once he does, the palace may feel compelled to provide context. And context, in this case, is not his friend. This isn't about guilt. It's about asymmetry. The palace holds records. Harry holds memory. Memory is powerful, but it's also subjective. Records are cold, and cold things don't bend. That reality appears to have settled in, which is why his reaction, muted, controlled, restrained, matters more than any outburst would have. It suggests awareness. Awareness that the story has reached a phase where emotion no longer drives outcomes. Documentation does, and that awareness changes behavior. This chapter doesn't end with confrontation. It ends with containment. A sense that Harry is choosing his steps carefully now, that he understands the terrain has shifted, that the next move, by anyone. Because the footage didn't just challenge his narrative. It placed it in proximity to something far less malleable, the palace's memory. And once memory enters the room, even the most compelling story has to make room for it. What happens next won't depend on anger. It will depend on restraint. And restraint, in this context, belongs to the side with the archive. There was no press conference. No palace aide stepping up to a podium. No carefully worded statement sliding into reporters' inboxes. No attempt to seize the narrative back from the courtroom. And that, in itself, was the message. Because if the palace wanted to speak to the court, it would never do so through argument. It would do so through atmosphere, through timing, through the quiet introduction of context that alters how everything else is heard. This is where the story moves away from Prince Harry's emotions entirely and into institutional behavior. The palace does not litigate in public. It never has. It does not rebut allegations point by point. It does not argue credibility on television panels. When it needs to communicate with the legal system, it does so indirectly, by shaping the environment in which legal judgments are made. That's what made the release of the footage feel so calculated. Not aggressive, not defensive, just present. It arrived while Harry was testifying, yes, but not during a dramatic moment. It didn't interrupt proceedings. It didn't derail schedules. It simply existed in parallel, like a shadow cast across the room. And suddenly, everything Harry said was heard differently. Not because the palace contradicted him, but because it reminded the court, and anyone paying attention, that there was another source of truth in play. One that didn't speak. One that recorded. The legal implications of that are subtle but profound. Courts don't just weigh facts. They weigh reliability, pattern, consistency over time. And while the palace is not a party to this lawsuit, its proximity to the subject matter means its actions inevitably influence how claims are contextualized. Think about the position Harry is in. He is arguing that the press invaded his privacy, that his movements, communications, and personal life were unlawfully intruded upon. That claim relies heavily on the idea that he lacked safe spaces, that he was exposed, vulnerable, left without institutional protection. Now imagine being a judge or legal observer processing that claim while knowing that the same institution he describes as distant allowed him access to its most controlled environments, access he did not publicly acknowledge. That doesn't negate his claim, but it reframes it. It introduces the possibility that Harry's experience of privacy was not binary, not simply present or absent, not just protected or exposed. It was conditional. And conditional privacy is far more complex legally than absolute vulnerability. The palace understands this complexity instinctively, which is why it didn't need to argue anything explicitly. It didn't need to submit evidence to the court. It didn't need to file amicus briefs or issue legal commentary. All it needed to do was allow the existence of something to be known. That existence alone shifts interpretive weight. Because now, when Harry speaks about being watched, the court must hold two ideas at once: that he may have been surveilled by the press, and that he was simultaneously within reach of an institution that monitored him in ways he has not described. Again, both can be true, but truth in court is not just about what happened. It's about how fully it's disclosed. This is where the palace's restraint becomes almost surgical. It didn't accuse Harry of deception. It didn't claim he misled anyone. It simply demonstrated that his narrative did not encompass the whole picture. And in legal contexts, partial narratives are dangerous, not because they are false, but because they invite correction. The palace's action can be read as a quiet clarification to the court. Whatever you decide about the press, understand that the institutional environment surrounding the claimant is more layered than has been presented. That's it. No more. No less. There's another layer here that's easy to miss. By releasing the footage when it did, and not earlier, the palace avoided appearing preemptive. It didn't seem reactive. It didn't look like it was trying to influence the trial's outcome directly. Instead, it positioned itself as something adjacent to the process, not participant. Context. That distinction is everything. Courts are deeply wary of external pressure, of interference, of narratives being shaped aggressively outside proceedings. But context, especially when it arises organically, is harder to dismiss. And this context didn't arrive with demands or commentary. It arrived with silence, which is why the footage felt less like a challenge to Harry and more like a message to the system itself. A reminder: the palace is not just a family. It is a record-keeping institution. And records don't argue with testimony. They sit beside it. There's a quiet irony here. Harry's legal battle is built on the idea that institutions, media institutions, specifically, abused their power to intrude upon him, that they overstepped, that they acted without accountability. Now, the most powerful institution in his life has intervened, but with the opposite approach. No intrusion, no overreach, just disclosure. And disclosure, done minimally, is one of the most defensible actions an institution can take. This is why the palace's move feels so hard to counter. If Harry were to challenge it, what would he say? That the footage shouldn't exist? That it shouldn't have been preserved? That it shouldn't have been allowed to surface? Those arguments would raise far more questions than they answer. Because the palace didn't claim the footage was incriminating. It simply allowed it to be known, which means any attempt to suppress or explain it risks drawing attention to the very mechanisms Harry has accused others of abusing. This is where the strategy becomes almost paradoxical. By saying nothing, the palace avoided contradicting Harry directly, but by showing something, it altered the interpretive field in which his words now operate. Judges are trained to notice that. They are trained to ask not just, is this claim plausible, but is it situated within a complete and accurate account of the surrounding circumstances? The footage nudges that second question into the foreground, and it does so without demanding an answer. There's also a longer game at play here. Legal cases end. Appeals conclude. Headlines fade. But institutional narratives endure. The palace is acutely aware that whatever emerges from this lawsuit will be cited, referenced, and interpreted for years, not just by journalists, but by historians, legal scholars, and future claimants. Allowing an incomplete narrative to harden into accepted truth would be far more damaging than any short-term criticism. So the palace acted, not to win this moment, but to protect the long arc. It inserted a footnote into history, a quiet one, but footnotes change how chapters are read. There's a reason the palace did not escalate further. It did not release additional footage. It did not provide timelines. It did not contextualize the access. That restraint signals confidence that the initial disclosure achieved its purpose. The purpose was not to overwhelm. It was to complicate. And complication is often all that's required to slow a narrative that has gained too much momentum. From a legal perspective, this matters because judges are cautious by nature. When faced with emotionally charged claims, they look for anchors, elements that ground the story in verifiable context. The palace provided one, not directly to the court, but to the environment surrounding it. And once that anchor exists, it subtly influences how testimony is received. Every assertion about being cut off, every claim of abandonment, every implication of institutional neglect, all of it is now filtered through the knowledge that access existed, that doors were not entirely closed, that relationships were not entirely severed. Again, none of this disproves Harry's experience, but it reframes its absoluteness. And absoluteness is often the first casualty of institutional memory. This is why the palace's message to the court wasn't confrontational. It was corrective. It said, "When you assess this case, remember that the claimant's relationship with us did not end as cleanly as has been suggested. That's all. No accusation. No rebuttal. Just a reminder that reality is rarely as tidy as narrative demands." There's one more dimension worth considering. By allowing this footage to surface now, the palace also signaled something to Harry himself, without saying a word. It signaled limits. Not limits on what he can say. Limits on how far his version of events can diverge from the institutional record before that record begins to speak. That signal is not hostile. It's clarifying. It says, you may tell your story, but understand that it exists within a broader archive. And archives do not negotiate. They wait. Which brings us to the uneasy calm that now surrounds this case. Harry continues his legal battle. The palace remains silent. The footage remains available. And the court proceeds, now aware that the story it's being asked to adjudicate is layered, not linear. This chapter doesn't end with a ruling. It ends with a shift in gravity, away from spectacle, toward substance. Because the moment the palace chose to let the footage exist publicly, it reminded everyone involved, lawyers, judges, commentators, and Harry himself, that the institution does not need to argue to be present. It only needs to remember. And once that memory is acknowledged, everything that follows is weighed against it. What comes next won't hinge on outrage or rebuttal. It will hinge on how much more context the palace is willing to allow into the light, and how carefully Harry chooses his next words, knowing now that silence no longer belongs exclusively to him. The most telling part of the palace's move wasn't what it showed. It was what it didn't. Because institutions that intend to end a conversation don't stop halfway. They overwhelm. They flood the zone. They release everything at once and let the weight of volume do the work. That didn't happen here. What happened instead was restraint so deliberate it almost felt instructional. The palace revealed just enough to alter the landscape, and then it stopped. Which leads to a question that's been quietly circulating among legal observers, palace insiders, and even some of Harry's longtime supporters. If this was the first thing the palace allowed to be seen, what else exists? That question isn't paranoid. It's structural. Royal households do not operate casually. Every movement is logged. Every access point monitored. Every deviation noted. This isn't surveillance in the tabloid sense. It's continuity management. A system designed to ensure institutional stability across generations. And stability requires memory. That memory doesn't just take the form of video. It takes the form of access logs, entry authorizations, security clearances, internal communications, emails, scheduling records, visitor approvals, escort assignments. All of it exists, not because anyone anticipated conflict, but because the monarchy plans for ambiguity as a matter of routine, which makes the partial nature of the release impossible to ignore. The palace didn't show logs. It didn't show timestamps beyond what was unavoidable. It didn't show who authorized the access. It didn't show how often it happened. It didn't show whether it was routine or exceptional. It showed presence, and presence alone was enough. That choice tells us something important. The palace did not want to prove a case. It wanted to establish capacity, because once capacity is established, escalation becomes optional, not necessary. This is where many people misunderstand power. Power is not the act of releasing information. Power is the ability to choose whether or not to. And the palace has just demonstrated that ability very clearly. For Prince Harry, this creates an entirely new set of constraints. Up until now, his public narrative has operated in an environment where contradiction was unlikely. The palace's silence functioned as a buffer. It allowed emotional accounts to stand unchallenged. It allowed memory to fill gaps that documentation never contested. That environment no longer exists. Now, every claim Harry makes, especially those delivered under oath, must coexist with the knowledge that an institutional record exists somewhere, unseen, but intact. That doesn't mean it will be released, but it means it could be. And that possibility changes everything. There's a psychological weight that comes with knowing you are no longer the sole narrator of your own story. It doesn't matter whether additional records ever surface. Their mere existence exerts pressure. It narrows the range of what can be said safely. It discourages absolutes. It rewards caution, which is exactly what we're seeing now. Harry's tone has shifted, not dramatically, subtly. More careful language, fewer sweeping statements, a noticeable avoidance of claims that hinge on total exclusion or complete abandonment. This isn't coincidence. It's adaptation. Because once the palace signals that it has more context than it's showing, the smartest move is not to provoke curiosity. The smartest move is to say less. That's why the absence of further disclosure is so powerful. The palace has left Harry and everyone else in a state of suspended awareness. A reminder that the first release was not an end. It was a demonstration. Consider this from an institutional perspective. If the palace believed Harry's claims were entirely accurate, there would be no need to release anything at all. Silence would suffice. If it believed his claims were dangerously false, it would likely release more decisively. Instead, it chose the middle path, which suggests the truth, as the palace understands it, is neither wholly aligned with Harry's narrative nor wholly opposed to it. It suggests complexity, and complexity is harder to weaponize, but easier to endure. That endurance is the monarchy's greatest advantage. Public opinion fluctuates. Court cases conclude, but institutional memory persists. And it persists whether anyone wants it to or not. This is why the question of what else exists matters more than any speculation about what might be released next. Because the palace does not need to release everything to benefit from having it. It only needs to remind everyone that it exists. There's a subtle shift that happens when people realize they're no longer arguing in a vacuum. Arguments become narrower. Claims become more qualified. Language becomes cautious. That's not because someone is lying. It's because someone understands that they are no longer alone with their version of events. For years, Harry has spoken about being watched. Now, he's aware that he has also been recorded. Not in the invasive sense he's described, but in the institutional sense he's rarely acknowledged. And that awareness introduces symmetry. Not moral symmetry, structural symmetry. Both sides now possess records. One side speaks, the other archives. That asymmetry is uncomfortable for someone whose strength has always been narrative control. Because stories can be revised, records cannot. This is where the palace's silence becomes almost deafening. It hasn't clarified. It hasn't denied. It hasn't escalated. It hasn't reassured. It has simply allowed the possibility of more to hang in the air. That possibility constrains behavior far more effectively than confrontation ever could. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility for Harry's supporters. What if the palace isn't done, but doesn't need to be? What if the initial release achieved exactly what it was meant to achieve? A recalibration, a narrowing of claims, a quiet acknowledgement that certain narratives have reached their limit. There's also a broader implication here that extends beyond Harry himself. If the palace is willing to let limited documentation surface in response to legal claims that implicate the institution indirectly, it sets a precedent. Not a legal one, a cultural one. It signals that while the monarchy will tolerate emotional accounts, it will not allow those accounts to crystallize into historical fact without context. That matters for the future, because Harry is not the last royal to leave. He will not be the last to speak publicly. He will not be the last to frame personal pain as institutional failure. The palace is laying down a quiet marker. Speak your truth, but understand that it exists alongside ours. And ours is written down. This is where the conversation turns from personality to structure. Because King Charles, and the palace more broadly, are not reacting to Harry as an individual anymore. They are responding to a pattern. A pattern in which personal grievance becomes public narrative, which then becomes assumed truth through repetition. The footage interrupts that progression, not forcefully, elegantly. And elegance, in institutional terms, is about minimizing exposure while maximizing effect. There's another detail worth lingering on. The palace has not hinted at further releases. No anonymous sources suggesting more to come. No warnings. No implied threats. That absence is intentional. Because threats provoke resistance. Possibility provokes restraint. And restraint is what we're seeing now, from Harry, from commentators, from even some journalists who have grown more cautious in how they frame his claims. The environment has cooled, not because the story is over, but because the power dynamics have shifted. Harry no longer controls escalation. The palace does, simply by choosing whether or not to remember out loud. This doesn't mean additional footage will surface. It doesn't mean logs will be released. It doesn't mean emails will appear. It means the option exists. And options are leverage. This chapter is about that leverage, not how it's used, but how it's held. Because leverage doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like restraint so complete it forces everyone else to slow down. And slowing down is exactly what the palace wanted. Not to stop the lawsuit. Not to silence Harry. But to ensure that the story unfolding around this case does not outrun the record that surrounds it. There's a final, unsettling thought that lingers here. What if the palace released the least damaging material first? Not to test reaction, but to set boundaries. To establish that it is willing to disclose, but not eager to do so. That it prefers silence, but not at the expense of distortion.